Hello guys, good morning. Good morning ka dyan. Good evening sa inyo guys. Kumusta kayo? Yan good evening sa inyo lahat. Nasa live tayo ngayon. What's up? Kanina nagkaroon tayo ng problema sa PowerPoint. Pero ngayon medyo okay na. So ang topic natin ngayon sa subject na Philippine Politics and Governance, the myth and types of globalization. Yan. Yan ang importante ngayon guys. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. At saka mahalaga ngayon is nandito tayo, nagja-jamming, nagbabanding Okay guys, what's up? Okay. Ito na tayo, magbubuelo. Magbubuelo na guys, magbubuelo na tayo guys. Alright, okay. Yan. Okay. Yan, what's up? Go! Alright. Yan ang natin, momentum. So, yan. Didiscuss natin yan. Tutuloy natin, guys. So, bago yan lahat, let us give credit sa sa resources natin, sa Division of Pasig City, sa development team of the self-learning module. Okay? Yan yung writer na si Elmer A. Rodahe, kanyang mga kasamaan, and then management team, si Maria Ibalo, Concepcion A. Agustin, OIC School Division Superintendent, at saka sa Education Program Supervisors. Yan, guys, maraming salamat sa inyo, guys. Okay? So, yan. Gumagalaw-galaw na. Kanina kasi hindi yung gumagalaw. No? Ayan, The myth and types of globalization. Ang ating pag-uusapan ngayon. Sabi nga nito, after centuries of technological progress and advances in international cooperation, the world is more connected than ever because of the international corporation. But how much has the rise of trade, umangat bang ang usaping kalakalan and the modern global economy, may epekto yan siyempre sa ekonomiya ng isang estado. Is it hurt for the business about the COVID-19 pandemic to the workers and consumers? Of course, obvious, no? Here is a basic guide to the economic side of this broad and much debated topic drawn from current research. So, let's go into the globalization. Ano ibig sabihin ng globalization? Sabi, globalization is a process by which ideas, goods and services, yan ang mahalaga dyan. Goods and services spread throughout the world. Yan, yung usaping kalakalan. No? So, in business, the term is often used in economic context to describe an integrated economy marked by free trade. Yan. The free flow of capital and corporate use of foreign labor. We have more laborers, more Filipinos that go to outside of our country to work. Yan and to maximize returns and benefit to the common good. But of course, no, they earn dollar once they send money here in the Philippines. We have a lot of money, the so-called remittance. So we are able to pay for the debt of the Philippines because we have the denomination, wherein the primary denomination in trade dollar yun, right? So, if I'm going to ask you, how globalization works. Huh? How globalization works. So we have the so-called flow of knowledge. Flow knowledge, ideas, and cultures expedited through internet communication. Yun yung globalization. Information, even any transaction of the business, no, always use the internet. Hang out for the message, no, for the communication, messenger. So that is very useful. Hangout in drive of your Facebook. I think Facebook or email. Yan. So globalization is driven by the convergence of political, cultural, and economic system that ultimately promote and often necessitate increased interaction, integration, and dependency amongst nations. So very obvious. We depend each other, the country, no? We depend on exportation from the other countries, and they depend also us for the importation, so the products that most probably. Alright, so that's it. So the more the disparate region of the world become intertwined politically, culturally, and economically. So the same globalized the world becomes, this international interaction and dependencies are enabled and accelerated by advances in technology, especially in transportation and telecommunication. So advanced na, no, paperless, some sort of like that about the communication, technology, some sort of the, you know, when you are going to order through online and then several days or day, no, you will receive it through Lazada, Shopee. That is how globalization works, because you can order the product even outside in the country. So we are able to purchase, no, through online. So let's go into the types of globalization. We have the so-called economic globalization. Economic globalization. So what is this? Sabi, these types focuses on the unification and integration of international financial markets. That is why, no, the arm's length transactions of the buyers and sellers internationally, no, and also the financial market there, no. So if you remember, we discussed this in business finance. Try to visit in this channel, Lakochirong EBM, even in Facebook, that is EBM also, the page. So you may notice there, or you will learn, no, about the financial markets. That is very important. So the financial institution is there, no, this is part of the financial markets, no, and a sort of the equity and debt securities, some sort of like that. That's the transaction globally that you are able to invest, no, to purchase stocks or to purchase debts for you in your for the purpose in order to earn your investment. So some sort of like that. Okay. So that's how economic globalization works. So as well as multinational corporation that have a significant influence on international markets. So sino ang nagbibigay ng influence sa international markets? That is the multinational corporation. Because the corporation is issuing stocks as well as the debts, no, equity. So if you want to invest to the other international corporations, so that's the very important. That's how economic globalization. You can invest to the other countries, to the other corporate, through email, through internet. You can purchase stocks there in connection to the you at least you have to communicate to the brokers, the writers of the stocks as given. So that's the economic globalization. So now, so how about the What is this? The so-called political globalization. So before that, I'll try to find the economic globalization. So, okay, wait a minute. Economic globalization, if we have the what is this? The so-called video clip in Creative Commons. Siyempre yung konti lang na oras. The Philippines Economic Report, what are the economic problems in the Philippines? What word economic? What does word economy mean? Word economic mean explanation. Okay. Economic globalization ang hinanap natin. Ilang minuto to. Economic consequences, global economic transition, economic context, economic, the regional. Globalization cannot be stopped. I think globalization cannot be stopped, sabi ni Jack Ma. Ay, 1 hour to. Matagal. Why economic, no? So, positive globalization, the globalist challenges. Okay. Global economic outlook. 1 hour. So, naghanap ako guys ng video para sa global economic globalization. What if iparinig ko na lang sa inyo to? Kasi meron naman dito talaga.
Economic globalization. Economic globalization is one of the three main dimensions of globalization commonly found in academic literature, with the two others being political globalization and cultural globalization, as well as the general term of globalization. Economic globalization refers to the free movement of goods, capital, services, technology, and information. It is the increasing economic integration and interdependence of national, regional, and local economies across the world through an intensification of cross-border movement of goods, services, technologies, and capital. Whereas globalization is a broad set of processes concerning multiple networks of economic, political, and cultural interchange, contemporary economic globalization is propelled by the rapid growing significance of information in all types of productive activities and marketization, and by developments in science and technology. Economic globalization primarily comprises the globalization of production, finance, markets, technology, organizational regimes, institutions, corporations, and labor. While economic globalization has been expanding since the emergence of transnational trade, it has grown at an increased rate due to an increase in communication and technological advances under the framework of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and World.
How about this one?
Magandang araw mga mag-aaral. Ako si Sir DQ, ang iyong magiging gabay sa pag-aaral ng kontemporaryong issue, partikular sa usapin ng globalisasyon. Pag-uusapan natin ngayon ang globalisasyong ekonomiko bilang isa sa anyo ng globalisasyon. Ang paksang ito ay nakaangkla pa rin sa most essential learning competency na nasasuri ang dahilan, dimensyon, at epekto ng globalisasyon. Ang globalisasyong ekonomiko ay umiinog sa kalakalan ng mga produkto at serbisyo. Mabilis na nagbago ang paraan ng palitan ng mga produkto at serbisyo sa pagitan ng mga bansa sa daigdig sa nagdaang siglo. Kinakitaan ito ng pag-usbong ng multinational corporation at transnational corporation na ang operasyon ay nakatuon hindi lamang sa bansang pinagmulan kundi maging sa ibang bansa. Ang multinational corporation ay ang pangkalahatang katawagan na tumutukoy sa mga namumuhunang kumpanya sa ibang bansa. Ngunit, ang mga produkto o serbisyong ipinagbibili ay hindi nakabatay sa pangailangang lokal ng pamilihan. Ilang halimbawa nito ay ang Unilever, Procter & Gamble, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Google, Uber, Starbucks, 7-Eleven, Toyota Motor, Dutch Shell, at iba pa. At ang transnational corporation naman ay tumutukoy sa mga kumpanya o negosyong nagtatatag ng pasilidad sa ibang bansa. Ang kanilang serbisyong ipinagbibili ay batay sa pangangailangang lokal. Binibigyang kalayaan na magdesisyon, magsaliksik at magbenta ang mga unit na ito ay na rin sa hinihingi ng kanilang pamilihang lokal. Marami sa kanila ay kumpanyang petrolyo, IT consulting, pharmaceutical. Halimbawa nito ang kumpanyang Shell, Telus International Philippines at GlaxoSmithKline.
The high ground.
Yan guys, yun yung momentum na natutunan natin about dyan sa globalization. Yung mga Starbucks, no? Mga produkto, multinational corporation. Yan ang napaka-importante sa economic globalization. At mayroon din mga serbisyong ino-offer ang isang bansa sa kabilang bansa. Yan. So, yan ang economic globalization. Okay? So, natututo tayo, no? Kahit pa paano. So, yan ang economic globalization sa ibang bansa. So, ngayon, tutuloy natin ang ating discussion about sa economic globalization ng bahagya, paunti-unti, guys. Ito, chine-check natin.
Korporasyong ito ang mga produkto at serbisyong naging bahagi na ng pang-araw-araw na pamumuhay ng mga Pilipino. Matagpuan ang mga nasabing kumpanya o korporasyon sa iba't ibang panig ng daigdig. Marami sa mga ito ay pag-aari ng mga lokal at dayuhang namumuhunan na nagtataglay ng malaking kapital. Sa katunayan, batay sa datos ng International Monetary Fund, ang ilan sa mga MNC at TNC ay higit pa ang kinikita sa gross domestic product ng ilang mga bansa. Malaki ang implikasyon ng pag-usbong ng mga multinational at transnational corporation sa isang bansa. Ilan sa mga ito ay ang pagdami ng mga produkto at serbisyo mapagpipilian ng mga mamimili na nagtutulak naman ng pagkakaroon ng kompetisyon sa pamilihan na sa kalaunan ay nagpapababa ng halaga ng mga produkto. Maituturing itong pakinabang sa mga mamimili. Bukod dito, nakalilikha rin ito ng mga trabaho para sa mga manggagawang Pilipino. Ngunit kaakibat na magandang epekto nito ay ang mga suliraning nakaapekto sa maraming bilang ng mga Pilipino. Isa na rito ang pagkalugi ng mga lokal na namumuhunan dahil sa di patas na kompetisyon dala ng mga multinational at transnational corporations na may napakalaking puhunan. Sa kalaunan, maraming namumuhunang lokal.
So, nakita nyo yung guys, may epekto ang global economic globalization, yung multinational globalization and transitional globalization, di ba? Kasi yung presyo ng mga lokal kung saan dito sa Pilipinas is natatalo ng mga multinational corporation and transnational ba yun? Corporation. Yan. Tuloy natin.
Ang tuluyang nagsasara. Malaki rin ang kakayahan ng mga ito na impluwensyahan ang pulisiya na ipinapatupad ng pamahalaan ng iba't ibang bansa tulad ng pagpapababa ng buwis, pagbibigay ng tulong pinansyal, at maging ang pagpapagaan ng mga batas patungkol sa paggawa at isyong pangkapaligiran. Nakukuha ang mga nasabing pabor sa pamamagitan ng pananakot na ilipat ang kanilang pamumuhunan patungo sa ibang bansa. Nagbubunga ito sa kalaunan ng higit na pagyaman at paglakas ng mga nasabing multinational corporation at transnational corporation. Nagdudulot naman ng paglaki ng agwat sa pagitan ng mayaman at mahihirap. Maliwanag itong natukoy sa pag-aaral ng Oxfam International sa taong 2017. Ayon sa kanilang pananaliksik, ang kinita ng 10 pinakamalalaking korporasyon sa buong mundo sa taong 2015 to 2016 ay higit pa sa kita ng 180 na bansa. Tinukoy din sa nasabing ulat na ang yaman ng nangungunang 8 bilyonaryo ay katumbas ng pinagsama-samang yaman ng 3.6 bilyon tao sa daigdig. May dalawang anyo na ekonomiya sa ilalim ng economic globalization. Una ay ang protectionism. Ito ay tumutukoy sa mga patakaran o pulisiya ng isang pamahalaan na nagbabawal sa internasyonal na kalakal upang matulungan ang mga lokal na industriya. Karaniwang ipinapatupad ang mga trade barriers upang mapabuti ang ekonomiya ng isang bansa, tulad ng taripa o buwis na ipinapataw sa mga inaangkat o iniluluwas na kalakal sa pagitan ng mga malalayang bansa. Halimbawa na dito ang North Korea na may limitadong trade agreements sa ibang bansa. Pangalawa ay ang trade liberalization o pagluwag o tuluyang paglansag sa mga restriksyong humahadlang sa malayang pagpasok ng kalakal sa iba't ibang panig ng daigdig. Halimbawa, ang Pilipinas ay nasa ganitong uri ng kalakaran dahil ito ay bukas o may malayang kasunduang pangkalakalan sa ibang mga bansa sa daigdig na nakatulong.
Yan, nakita nyo guys, kahit meron tayong economic globalization, meron naman tinatawag na protectionism. Pinoprotektahan ng mga lokal na negosyo para hindi naman tayo malugi, di ba? Tsaka mayroon na yung tinatawag na open, yung international trade na hindi linilimitahan ng isang bansa. So yan subscribe nyo si DQ TV at iba pa. Malaking tulong yung kanyang discussion. So kahit papaano nagkaroon tayo ng idea hinggil sa economic globalization. Okay? So malaking epekto sa local na traders yung nandito sa Pilipinas. Tinatalo tayo ng mga multinational and transnational corporation. Yan ang mahirap pagka dumayo yung isang bansa, di ba? Dito mag-invest sa atin, tatalo tayo. Yan global. Global economy. Yan. Napaka-importanting mga usapin hinggil sa bagay na iyan. Kaya, di ba? So, na-appreciate natin yung tulong na ibang bansa. Nagkakaroon naman tayo ng empleyado, labor, nagkakaroon ng trabaho. Okay?
The current economic framework, which was predicated on the belief.
Panoorin natin to, nasa Credit Common to, pwedeng panoorin. Sabi dito, Creative Commons Attribute License Reuse Allowed. So therefore, we are allowed to watch this one. Let's do this one and let's watch this one.
the current economic framework, which was predicated on the belief that lowering taxes, liberalization, financial market liberalization, trade liberalization, would lead to faster economic growth and to everybody's well-being increasing. We now realize that those ideas were wrong. I'm Joe Stiglitz. I teach at Columbia University. The world today is facing a confluence of several problems, many of which are interrelated, represent some real challenges that so far our political system has not been able to address effectively. Because the fruits of what limited economic growth were not widely shared, large fractions of the population are seeing their income stagnate or even decline. A notion that globalization would itself lead to the growth of economies and everybody would be better off. Well, economic theory actually was much more qualified in its endorsement of free trade. For instance, I showed many years ago if trade liberalization could and would increase risk, the consequence of that was that everybody in all the countries could be worse off. What that says is before you liberalize, you ought to think about making sure your markets are working well, particularly in countries like the United States. Those who were pushing for liberalization at the same time opposed assistance that would have helped people make the adjustment. One of the most important contributions in our understanding of trade were a series of theorems by Paul Samuelson, which showed that in advanced countries, liberalization would lower the incomes of unskilled workers. No one, when they were pushing for trade liberalization, even mentioned this. Markets are not in general efficient. We've known that markets are neither efficient nor stable, and yet policymakers and many economists proceeded as if, quote, economics taught us that markets were always efficient and stable. I mean, if everybody's against it, why is it proceeding? Well, there's a very easy answer. It was a corporate agenda. It was an agenda that had the effect of lowering wages, driven mainly by the desire to increase profits. You see that vividly in, for instance, the intellectual property agenda, increase the profits of big pharma at the expense of access to life-saving medicines all over the world. We didn't provide the social protection that we should have provided. If we're going to really have sustained economic growth based on globalization, we need to rewrite the rules of globalization. We have to have a deeper reform in our economic system, a new social contract that ensures that growth is inclusive, that there is shared prosperity.
Yan guys, yan ang ano natin. Yan Creative Commons Attribution License Reuse Allowed. Yan si Globalization this content. So please subscribe, New Economic Thinking, Yan. Hanapin natin. Mayroon pa dito, guys. Punta ka dito para Creative Commons ka, para hindi ka makopyright. Meron dito si Uncle Obama, yan. Sabi dito,
I think globalization cannot be stopped. Nobody can stop globalization. Nobody can stop trade. And I believe if trade stops, war starts. Trade is the way to solve to dissolve the war, not to cause the wars.
trade daw,
I think
magsusultang war.
globalization did a fantastic jobs in the past 30 years. Enriched a lot of countries. But, of course, caused a lot of problems, right? Young people did not have opportunities. Small business have not opportunities. Developing countries were neglected. But it's only 30 years. It's a baby. It's a growth. You have to improve it. If you do not improve it, then you kill it. It's easy. Most of the time, to kill something is much easy. So my beliefs, it's our generation's job. Today, we have a better technology. We have a better knowledge about globalization. And it's our generation's responsibility or opportunity to improve it. Tell me, how can you stop globalization?
Yan. Yan din si Jack Ma. No? So, global economy in COVID-19, cultural consequences. Yan, makakahanap tayo dito marami. Wala tong copyright kasi nasa Creative Commons tayo. Ito, try natin to. हंgang इlang minuto to
आज ही डाउटनेट ऐप डाउनलोड करें। डाउटनेट पर होगा अब आपके सभी मैथ्स, केमिस्ट्री, फिजिक्स और बायोलॉजी डाउट्स का सफाया। बस अपने क्वेश्चन की फोटो खींचो, उसे क्रॉप करो और तुरंत वीडियो सोल्यूशन पाओ। डाउनलोड नाउ।
हे गाइस, तो हम डिस्कस कर रहे हैं चैप्टर 9 जो कि है ग्लोबलाइजेशन। और हमने पिछले टॉपिक में ग्लोबलाइजेशन की मीनिंग को समझा था। इस टॉपिक में हम देखेंगे कॉजेज ऑफ ग्लोबलाइजेशन, यानी कि वो ऐसे कौन से रीजंस हैं जिसकी वजह से जो ग्लोबलाइजेशन है एज अ फिनोमिनन वो इमर्ज करा है। ठीक है, तो एक इम्पॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट जो है ग्लोबलाइजेशन का वो ये है कि ये कोई सिंगल फैक्टर की वजह से इमर्ज नहीं हुआ।
How will the China-US trade war impact on global economy? Concept of globalization. Ito, pakinggan natin to. Creative Commons reuse allowed.
Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We are going to discuss the ongoing trade wars which seem to have intensified with President Trump's latest, shall we say, sanctions on China, which China is also responding to. This, of course, means destabilization of the global trade regime, which we have discussed earlier with others as well, but with Professor Bishwajit Dhar, whom we have in the studio today. Bishwajit, we have discussed these issues a number of times. The threat it brings to the trading system as a whole. It doesn't seem that the momentum, which we thought might be just maneuvering, has stopped. It seems now the entire trade with China is in danger of coming under various sanctions.
Exactly. I think President Trump has been mentioning this the 500 billion amount for past few months. So if you see what US imports from China is actually 507 billion. That's what the number was last year. So what he's actually talking about is targeting the entire import from China, and that is what he's going. I think he's going incrementally. You know, it was first 50 billion, which was in August, and now it's 200 billion. And so from the US's side, it's 250 billion, and China has immediately retaliated with 60 billion. So it's 250 billion versus 110 billion that we're looking at now.
You know, but the one thing that's interesting is we thought that it would have repercussions across the trading regime, and this would at least introduce problems for different economies, including the US economy. But the US economy seems to be doing better. The dollar has strengthened, and in fact the problem is with the, shall we say, the middle income group countries like Brazil, like Turkey, like India, whose currencies are weakening at the moment.
No, I think we have to split this issue up into two parts. The part about US economy sort of getting the momentum right now, I firmly believe it's actually past legacy. You'll remember that post 2008, so Bush started this, but Obama did a whole lot of pump priming, and many of the initiatives that he has taken were of sort of medium term kind, and investing in technology and sort of strengthening the production base, and he was doing it quite silently. So what I saw, and actually I analyzed this, it was de facto industrial policy coming, but not in the name.
But you say they were doing planning, something they
were actually doing planning.
Argued against?
They're actually doing planning. They're actually doing planning. They're actually providing a whole lot of subsidy, something that they accuse the Chinese of. And the interesting part was that a lot of these subsidies were routed through the defense sector,
which comes outside the trade regime.
Absolutely. So NASA was doing a lot of the the backstopping work, and so all this was happening in the US, and I think the fruits of this is now being reaped by Trump. But let me also say that if this goes any further, then the impact of tariffs will clearly be on the prices of the products that US imports from China, and almost everything that the Americans consume in every sector is somewhere or the other linked to imports from China. So what are we looking at? We're looking at actually a sort of a general price rise, kind of an inflationary pressure.
But if the exchange rate changes in favor of a stronger dollar, then this will not be seen by the American people.
Nobody is going to come, because till now we are talking about only $50 billion. Now once is extended it to 200 billion, you are actually covering, bringing in a whole lot of products into this basket.
50% of all imports that
50%
US does from China.
That is right, 50% of all imports. Now, when he had imposed tariffs on 50 billion worth of imports, the tariff was 25%. Yeah? So initially he actually threatened a similar kind of tariffs, 25%. And I think he's been advised by a whole lot of people not to go that way, because that would have immediately put that shock in the US economy. Now once you subject the economy to this kind of a price shock, then you are going to get into a vicious cycle.
Let me be the devil's advocate here. Suppose there is a 10% tariff, which is what is imposed at the moment on this 200 billion, but the Chinese currency weakens by also 10%. Arguments.
Right.
Then there is no effect on the American consumer.
Let me argue this way, that it's difficult to visualize a situation where the Chinese currency will depreciate by another 10%. Because if you look at the past 6 months, there's already been a depreciation of about 9 or 10%. Yeah? And it's highly likely that in another 6 months, there's going to be another 10% depreciation. Now that is very, 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 very unlikely. So my sense is that this entire, sort of 10% increase in tariffs will be passed on to the consumers in terms of higher prices. Now, once you have the higher prices, once you have the inflationary pressures, then then you'll have to then go in for interest rate hike. The good monetarists will actually do this, yeah, and then the vicious cycle will come in.
Inflation, cost of money going up.
Yeah, and the pressure on the US dollar.
Let me.
So, welcome to the discussion. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm editor-in-chief and co-founder of Quartz. We're a business news site, and we have co-developed this session with the World Economic Forum. Hello also to the people who are watching this session via live stream on Quartz's site, qz.com, and on Yahoo Finance, which is also streaming this session. So the goal of this session is to tackle one of the more urgent questions posed this week. Can a renewed focus on its potentially damaging local effects save economic globalization from itself? And for clarity, globalization can mean lots of things. Here we're primarily focused on international economic integration. This is a topic, admittedly, that is still unfolding amid developments in technology that are changing both where work is done and whether work is done by humans at all. And in the mix are also advances in local economic development policy, corporate practices, and measures such as universal basic income. So our very distinguished panelists committed to tackling this important topic are Chanda co-chair. She's the managing director and chief executive officer of ICICI Bank in India, having helped establish ICICI Bank, which is now India's largest private bank, in the early 1990s. She's shaped modern retail banking in India. Just next to her, we have Mauricio Cardenas, the Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia since 2012. He has a PhD in economics and a long career at the highest levels of government and policymaking in Colombia. Next to him is Sharon Burrow. She's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation in Brussels. She has a background in education and was a teacher in Australia earlier in her career. She's a co-chair of this year's forum meeting. Next to her is Devin Wenig. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of eBay, the online marketplace with about 170 million buyers. He's the former CEO of Thomson Reuters Markets. Next to him is Manoush Shafiq. She's Director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's a PhD in economics also, so we have at least two on this panel. Her career has spanned academia and public policy, including at the World Bank, IMF. She's held senior UK government roles, including Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. And then finally, we have Rich Lesser. He's the Global Chief Executive Officer and President of Boston Consulting Group. BCG is in 50 countries and is focused on driving strategy and major change around the world. So for those of you in the audience, we're going to take questions before the end of this session. And those of you following us online can ask questions throughout this session by going to wef.ch/ask. I'll receive them on the iPad that's on the table next to me and try and pull them into the discussion. So I want to start, before we get into this discussion, by asking a foundational question of everyone here in the audience. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands to answer this question. Do you believe economic globalization is a net positive for societies? So if you believe economic globalization is a net positive for societies, please raise your hand. Okay, that's a good, solid majority. That's a very strong majority. On the panel, do we? Majority also, okay. Great, thank you. Sharon, I'm going to come to you first. So could you summarize the downside? This panel's about trying to figure out if globalization can be managed in such a way that the downsides are offset, are minimized. Can you start by explaining what you think the principal downsides of globalization are?
Okay, so we're certainly not anti-globalization, but the current model has failed working people. You have a model of globalization that means the world is 3 times richer than it was 30 years ago. That's a good thing. But it hasn't been shared. We have historic inequality, we have massive unemployment, and that wealth has been built off a global model that is based on low pay, insecure, and often unsafe work. And when you want to know what that looks like, 94% of our supply chains where that model dominates are actually a hidden workforce. No CEO takes direct responsibility. In fact, only a few CEOs actually follow the UN guiding principles for business and human rights and do due diligence and make their supply chains transparent and put grievance and remedy in place. I've just come out of Ethiopia, and I can tell you I met a woman there last week called Yeshi. That's not about high tech or new tech, by the way. It's about the next wave of low technology and textile manufacturing sweeping into Ethiopia. She earns $20 a month. $20 a month. She tries to feed 3 children on that. I told the Prime Minister and the CEOs of the textile companies, who we all know well, the European and American brands, they could afford to pay 4 times that and still pay less than Bangladesh. And you know the story of Bangladesh. And so when I tell you what little it would take to actually reinvigorate people's trust, it would take $50 a month in the poorest countries in Asia. It would take doubling the normal wages, quadrupling Yeshi's wage in Africa. It would take a little more than $50 in Latin America. But when you know that corporations earn up to $17,000 in profit for every supply chain worker, their direct employees and their hidden workforce, why is it that we can't share that prosperity? And then when I tell you that 75% of the world's people have little or no social protection, and yet, as I said, the world's 3 times richer, and it will cost less than 6% of GDP, why are we perpetuating a model that is in fact exploitative, and why is it that people wonder why working people have such a distrust of the global environment.
So globalization has failed working people. Manoush, I want to ask you, would you add anything to that in terms of framing the problems we're looking at today?
Well, I think globalization makes these competitive pressures transmit around the world much more quickly. But I think the big driver is technological change, which has increased the returns to very high skilled workers dramatically and reduced those to lower skilled workers, which has resulted in this massive inequality that Sharon describes. So we have seen growth in inequality, and that has been made worse by the fact that if you look at what's happened to tax reform in most countries over the last 20 years, in most of the advanced economies, our tax systems have become less progressive. Top tax rates have been lowered, corporate tax rates have been lowered, and VAT has been increased, which is a very unprogressive tax. And so we've had a technological set of changes which have increased inequality, and we've had tax reform which has become less progressive and made that even worse.
So before we get into some of the solutions, Rich, I want to just pull you in for a second. Manoush alluded to technology, and I think one of the challenges of this discussion is separating globalization and technology as driving factors for some of the issues that we're. Can you help us sort of frame that as we head into some of the solutions?
Sure. So it's actually a really important underlying component because it will add opportunities and also a lot of different pressures. A lot of the globalization logic, looking backwards over the last few decades, has been a low-cost sourcing logic. That there were opportunities to arbitrage labor, to take advantage of large countries that could manufacture at low cost and to use that as a source. And that's when we think about globalization and you ask people, that's normally what they think they're talking about. In fact, the world that we're going to is changing the rules quite a lot because the nature of technology is allowing production to be done in exceptionally efficient ways, to be much closer to market, more capital intensive to build it, in many cases a smaller workforce, but also much closer to demand and much closer to customers. And we have started to see factor costs start to equalize more certainly between China and the US. It's a lot closer than it was a while ago, and other countries have closed some of that gap, but also that the technology logic allows one to source production closer to market. So we'll see relocalization like the Adidas plant in Germany or others to come around the world from multiple manufacturers. But they're also, and the other thing that comes with that is frankly, and I think Devin can speak to this much better, the ability to open up markets to the world so that smaller manufacturers who are historically limited to smaller markets nearby have so much more opportunity than they had before. The flip side is the pressure on high quality workforce to raise the standard of workforce, and I don't mean just in the developed world, I mean around the world, is going to be really intense. And many communities and many countries have underinvested in building human capital. And frankly, to the point that you were raising earlier, Sharon, I think companies in today's world have a huge responsibility about investing in human capital. It's the right thing to do societally for the reasons you articulated. It's the right thing to do business-wise because if you can't get a workforce that's able to adapt quickly enough when technology is changing every single year, your risk of being left behind as an enterprise is much higher than it was a few years ago.
And so what you're saying is that globalization was a driving factor for some of these inequalities and jobs dislocation. In the past, technology, automation, might potentially be a driving factor going forward. And so we'll look at...
Can I just add one addendum?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sharon has rightfully pointed out some of the very serious challenges that exist in the model. We've also pulled hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty in recent decades. And as we talk about globalization, we have to acknowledge the challenges, and there are many, and it's appropriate to put them on the table. We also have to acknowledge many lives around the world that are in a different place than 20 or 30 years ago, and then seek to figure out how we improve everybody's opportunity in the years ahead.
Yeah, great, excellent. So we're going to keep this in mind. We're going to walk through three different areas. The first one is social safety nets. The second one is empowering local communities. And the third one is education, training, and all of those things that Rich just raised. So I want to start with social safety nets. I want to turn to you, Minister Cardenas first, and ask you, what does a modern social safety net look like? What does it need to look like?
Well, first, thank you. I think there's a overwhelming majority here that considers that globalization is a net gain. I am part of that majority. But the real question here is how can we make globalization work better? I think there is always the option to improve the effects of globalization. And there are a number of ways, because I think globalization, if you think about countries at that level of aggregation, it's probably good. It's very difficult to argue against that. Per capita income for the majority of countries has increased faster after globalization. But when you start discussing issues at the level of an industry, a region, a city, and certainly at the level of the individual, is when you start seeing that globalization hasn't worked for everyone. So the question is, how do we make sure that it works well for the majority? That it's that what we say for the aggregate is also true for the majority of the individuals. And I think that's where the issue of social safety nets comes to place. What I would like to argue is that there are three ways in which we can make globalization work better. One is by compensating the losers. There are sectors, there are cities, there in many of our countries, unskilled labor, those jobs are being lost, so you need to compensate, and that means transfer. But you also have to create more opportunity. That's more or less a human capital issue. You have to make sure that the ones that are losing because of globalization get trained in a way that in the future they don't lose. So that means creating those opportunities. And thirdly, I would say that we have to complement. So this is 3 C's: compensating, creating, and complementing globalization. And what do I mean by that? Many of our countries have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. That's just one example. There are many, many issues, many ways in which you can complement globalization. It's like saying, well, a country has an agenda which is not just to make sure that globalization works, is concerns about sustainability, concerns about making sure that you eradicate poverty, that you provide basic services to the majority of the population. So it would be absolutely wrong to think that globalization can be in itself a development strategy. You need to complement it. So my answer, before we go into specifics on how to do that, will be complement, create opportunity, and compensate immediately with transfers the losers. Now, for this, you need the state. And here the taxes issue is crucial, because globalization has also meant more tax competition, a race to the bottom, cutting taxes. We all think about the US tax reform, but that's just the most recent example. It's not the only one by no means. So it's like contradictory in terms that we have competition in tax matters, reducing tax revenues, but at the same time we need the state to deal with the effects of globalization.
Manoush, you've written recently about a social contract and the idea that there is a new social contract. Can you summarize what that, at a high level, what that would look like?
Well, we know that we're starting from a place which is highly unequal and which globalization and technological changes are continuing, and we know we have an automation revolution about to happen and transform work. And so I think we need to rethink, how are we going to help people adjust to this new economy in which automation and technology will be so important? And there are many elements to that. We have to think about retirement ages, as people's work lives are going to have to grow longer. We have to think more creatively, I think, about part-time work and making part-time work just as easy, and that you get your benefits and that you aren't discriminated against if you're a part-time worker. I think we have to invest a lot more in active labor market policies, which means basically helping workers train for new jobs. There are some countries, the one that everyone always cites is Denmark, which are really good at that. They spend 1.7% of GDP. Most countries don't spend anywhere near enough to help workers transition to the jobs of the future. And so I think we need all of those things: portability, more part-time work, more flexibility about the length of working lives, enabling investment, and we need a floor. Now that floor can look like many things, but we need some kind of floor on people's incomes to make sure that people don't reach a point of desperation.
In fact, we have a common kind of commitment to this, because we've called for a new social contract. Our premise is, if you don't have the floor, including social protection, but then you don't have a minimum wage on which people can live with dignity, evidence-based, what's the minimum you need, and you don't have bargaining so that you can actually share the productivity, then you won't heal the fractures in the workforce today and therefore enable us to negotiate our way through Industry 4.0, the energy transition. So in other words, we call it a new social contract with a just transition. We need to change the rules.
I don't think you mentioned a universal basic income, but I'd be interested in what the panel's view on that. That is, as a definition of a social safety net, is among the tools that people talk about.
I mean, it's expensive. Estimates for most of the advanced economies are it would be about 6.5% of GDP. That's the IMF's recent estimate. And so very few countries can afford to add 6.5% of GDP to public spending. And if it comes at the expense of programs that are more targeted, I think it's problematic. I think for many low-income countries, I think it can be a very good solution if you fund it with progressive taxation. Because in low-income countries, there's a lot of evidence now, about 80 randomized control trials, which show that giving poor people in low-income countries small amounts of money can have huge benefits for nutrition, education, their life prospects. So I think you have different answers in low and middle-income countries relative to high-income countries.
And I'm going to pull Devin and Chanda in a second, but Minister Cardenas, universal basic income, what's your view?
Well, if it's 6% of GDP, it's unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's not possible. I think we have to move in a way in which we create more formal jobs, more social security, but also in a way that is sustainable. That means to the extent that the economy can support that, to the extent that we have the resources to support that. So it's a slow process. It's not something that you can do overnight.
So one of the topics that's come up is looking on a region, local level, and Chanda, maybe I'll go to you. You have the experience of building out a retail banking network in India. What sort of an insight does that give to you into how these issues play out on that level?
Yeah, so I mean, if you talk of a country like India, I think, whether we talk of the impact of globalization or building social nets, I think the remedy or really the solution has to be very tailor-made to what that country specifically is. I mean, if it's an aging country, I think you only tend to look at pensions and so on. But India, when we have more than 50% of the population that's below 25 years of age, I think the focus really has to be about how do we create sustainable livelihood opportunities for that young demography, because we want to make sure that the demography is a demographic dividend for us, and it turns out to be a demographic dividend for us. So it's about, I think, as I view it, it's not just about providing education or providing health or providing financial inclusion. I think we have to make it economic inclusion. And let me tell you how the country has therefore been moving on this. I mean, you've seen that in the last, from 2014 onwards, first starting with financial inclusion, the country's opened about 300 million bank accounts of people who were totally unbanked so far. That's just about opening the bank account, but then that becomes the fulcrum around which the entire social net, safety net improves or builds, because around that, then you build ways of then directly transferring government benefits. And there the countries use technology to do direct benefit transfers, which means that more money directly reaches people rather than it being taken away by the intermediaries. Then from there on, we're talking about helping people create livelihood. So we have in the country something called Mudra, which means we actually help entrepreneurs or people become entrepreneurs. And it's again about 100 million people who have been given micro loans to become entrepreneurs, and of which 1/3 are those who had never got any credit in the past at all and were never bankable at all. So I think you create different kind of social nets on the basis of what your country's requirements are, and that's what India has been doing.
And it sounds like just pulling them into the economy is among the
absolutely, and making them participate in the economic growth more and more.
We have some great questions coming in here, which we'll get to in a moment. It's wef.ch/ask for anyone who is following. Devin, I want to pull you in. So eBay, among the things that eBay is looking at in terms of this is small businesses and how in sort of regions, local areas, cities, to have an impact on the economic opportunities there. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it matters to me what role technology plays in society. It matters to me particularly what role my company plays. I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on the negatives and how to constrain globalization, but I loved what I just heard because the other side of it is how do we give fair and full access so that people participate in the economy and take advantage of globalization. What we see, our business is a platform. We don't sell things, we enable other people to sell things. And most people that sell on eBay are 20 million small businesses. They're entrepreneurs, everyone from a one-person single mom that works out of her living room to the entire spectrum, and in every country of the world. What I see is that when people have access fairly to technology, they thrive and they grow. And we're very focused on that. And we've done things like I just came from here, from Akron, Ohio, which is definitely not India. I understand that, and it's not some of the places you're talking about, but Akron is a disadvantaged town that's lost its manufacturing base. And now in some of the old plants that were steel and rubber manufacturing plants, you see entrepreneurs that came out of nowhere that for the first time have access to online tools, and they're growing and they're revitalizing Akron's economy. And we've partnered with the local government to bring them into eBay, train them, microloans, like the entire spectrum. And there's so much optimism about revitalization of this old Rust Belt town. And it is not rich people, and it's not a concentration. These are entrepreneurs at the most basic level who are supporting their families with small business. What I would like to see, rather than universal basic income, is how do we train people and how do we use the money that would be spent giving people money to give them access. That means broadband, that means loans and capital, that means training, that means proficiency for the digital economy, and that does not mean 1 billion people who are software engineers. That just means proficiency with the economy that's coming. I think that's a massive opportunity. And if we don't accelerate that and lean into it, we're missing a huge global opportunity to lift people out of poverty.
So we're going to shift to this question of training and what is reskilling and what does it look like when that's successful. Rich, I just want to, before we get there, I want to pull you in just for a second. So part of the issue is job dislocation from specific areas like Akron, probably, as manufacturing has moved out. What do you think the response?
I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I can totally relate to the Akron story. Yes.
So what is the responsibility of a business, do you think, in the face of this dislocation, to float their workers to the next island of employment, basically?
So can I step back to that? I think the WEF has been probably more than any other institution talking about multi-stakeholder engagement for decades. I really think we're at a moment in time where there's a convergence of interest that says multi-stakeholder is so important right now, in particular, partly due to technology, partly due to income inequality, partly due to populism and societal stress, and partly due, frankly, to the clear observations that it's in businesses' best interest for their own value creation to take a broader approach. And I think it has 4 elements. One is the ability to clearly and sharply articulate purpose. People know why you're there, what you're intending to achieve. It attracts great talent to your company. It helps you sharpen what you try to do in the world. The second is around total societal impact and understanding broadly how you can take what you're good at and tailor it, just like you're doing in Akron, Devin. That you take what your natural skills are and you apply it in ways that allow your core strategies to reflect a societal impact, not just a near-term impact. The third is around human capital development. So recognizing that the rate of change in the world forces forces companies to recognize if they don't invest in developing the right human capital strategies, they will be left behind with what's happening in technology. And the fourth is around diversity and inclusion and making sure that what they do can draw in everyone and benefit everyone, whether that's related to women or ethnic minorities or people of different nationalities, that's just good business. It's good business. And I think purpose, total societal impact, human capital investment, diversity and inclusion are the agenda, and if you take that agenda on, that is a win-win. That is societally oriented, that is business oriented in a rapidly changing world.
But sorry, I was trying to link the three things that you said about empowering local communities, about training people, and about the responsibility of business. No, and the responsibility of the business. And I want to just give an example of what we do now as an organization. Earlier I spoke about the country, but as an organization, we are a bank, we are a financial services institution. So we, in any case, said that to get people more included economically, we should also focus on rural areas and not just on urban areas. So we actually picked 500 villages in India, and we said we would digitize the entire payment systems and open their bank accounts and bring them into the part of the financial system. But that was not it. We said that if we have to increase the sustainable livelihood of those local communities, we combine this financial digitization with two more things. One is providing skill training, and the second is providing them market and credit access. So in terms of training, what we do is we actually take the local training to these rural areas. We train the people into skills which are locally relevant to their community, and then we, through use of technology, provide them the market linkages, either it's to suppliers and so on and so forth, and we provide them the microloans, because then again we are a bank. And through that, what we have done is we have trained almost 200,000 youth who otherwise could not afford to either get educated or start a business of their own. We've trained about 200,000 of such youth, provided them a part of the credit. 95% of them are either now in an employment or earning an income as becoming an entrepreneur. And you'd be surprised to know, because we talk of a country like India and we talk of rural areas, more than 50% of them are young women and girls from the rural areas. And these are these girls who, talking about textiles and so on, I met a lady in one of the smaller villages in interiors of Rajasthan where she was not even earning $50 a month. But through this training, through this market access, through this microloans, she is now earning about $500 a month. And that's not it. She tells me, and in her local language, is that you come back next year and I would have employed 5 more young girls who would be earning at least half as much as what I am. And this is my commitment to you, and you come back and see my prosperity next year.
And so you've trained over 200,000 people in local areas, and these are not, you're not training people to work for the bank, you're just training
No, not
them
at
to
all.
be-
This is absolutely apart from those who work on it. These are skills like vermicomposting, these are skills like brick making, these are skills like air conditioner repairs, these are skills like mobile phone repairs, stitching, embroidery, and some of them also want to get into sales, office administration, and so on. So what we have done is we've tied up with about 20 companies on the side who give us the content for providing the training. We've tied up with about 1,000 of our clients on the other hand, who either give them market access or employment to these people. So these are not bankers, these are not people which we are doing for us to absorb them in the bank. These are basically local communities who cannot afford to get further educated, who cannot afford to just on their own, they're not bankable. We provide them the skills and then we make them bankable.
In fact, we have an organisation called SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Organisation in India, with almost 2 million members, and they build cooperatives and they use platforms to access markets. They've built their own childcare centres. It might shock people to know childcare is not a formal sector, not recognised as a contribution to the economy in India, and we want to fix that. But I wanted to actually go to the point you made. This model of globalisation has simply said, well, these are the consequences, we'll provide structural adjustment, but frankly, if your community's devastated, bad luck. That's just the price of a globalised economy. This morning I actually was on an interview panel with the CEO of Enel, an energy company from Italy. Now, with climate transition, we fought for a just transition to be put in the Paris Agreement. We now want to see just transition on the basis of both technological change as well as energy shifts and industrial processing shifts. But what does Enel do? They're reducing their, they have to reduce their carbon-fired power stations. They're going to close something like 23 by 2025. That's a massive challenge, I can tell you, just having held the hand of a community in Australia that took 5 years and slightly rocky outcome, but now a just transition. But in fact, they're growing, of course, their renewable energy sector at the same time. But are they walking away from those sites? No. They're taking responsibility where they're not suitable for renewable energy to look to industrial renewal. And so whether it's the Indian model or whether it's anywhere, if we don't take responsibility collectively for reinventing our communities, then what are we actually saying? That we're just going to accept the consequences of a profit take that creates the 1% and everybody else be damned? That's not the model we need. And if we don't affect just transitions, and that means community renewal as well as workers' rights, their pensions, their skill set, income, etc. But UBI can be part of this, but we say it's an idea you should explore carefully. You know, in India there have been, in fact, examples where there's nothing else, there's no social safety net, and it's created a fundamental market and security. But if you go to most countries and you have to make a choice between less than 6% on a universal social protection floor, health, education, child protection, maternity protection, unemployment benefits, pensions, or you give people a tiny sum of money because you're not generating the jobs and the sustainability up front, then what's the choice? I'd rather see people with security when they need it rather than everybody having a tiny bit of income that may be very, very useful in circumstances where there's nothing, but is not the floor that we've committed to through the Sustainable Development Goals, as the Minister said.
We're going to go to questions in just a few minutes. Before we do that, I want to ask a question about what are the skills needed for the future, and maybe Manoush, you can start us here in terms of dislocation, inequality. What are the skills required? Then maybe Devin, you can come in next.
I mean, I think it's no accident that the people who voted for populist parties around the world and voted against globalization are people with, by and large, the common characteristic is low levels of education. And it's not because they were stupid. In fact, it's because they're very smart, because they figured out that this system, given that they have low levels of education, will not be in their interests. And so increasing education has to be part of making any type of new globalization work differently. So that's just a starting point. I think in terms of the skills you need, I mean, we know that automation is going to mean that anything that is routine and repetitive will be automated. So the skills of the future are things that are not routine and not repetitive. Sometimes people call them the soft skills. They're creative skills. And I think, since I run a university, of course, teaching people how to learn is the most important skill we can give them, giving them the research skills, the ability to find information and synthesize it and make something of it. And the other thing I'd say about the skills of the future is we know people's work lives are going to be much longer. You know, our children will probably work until they're in their 80s at least, if not longer, and they will need to retool multiple times. And so that ability to learn will need to be able to be deployed several times because they'll change. I mean, I heard a fantastic statistic the other day. The average CV on LinkedIn has more than 20 jobs in it today, in 5 to 6 different career streams. That's today. So already people, admittedly you could say people who are on LinkedIn are more likely to want to change jobs.
They're the overachievers.
Exactly. But it's indicative, and I think it's a forward indicator of the degree to which people will change jobs in future. And we need to give them tools, both the ability to learn, but also educational institutions need to give them the tools to enable them to retool multiple times over their careers.
Devin, skills of the future?
I mean, I'm going to say what you might expect me to say, but I think what's misunderstood is that technology is not a sector. Technology and digital enablement is the economy. There is nothing that won't end up being touched deeply by what's happening in technology revolution, and because of that, I do think that the education system is woefully unprepared for the economy that's, I would say, is coming, but it's already here. That does not mean that what the world needs is 2 billion software engineers. What it does mean is that even in creative skills and arts, digital proficiency is increasingly the difference between people that are thriving and succeeding and those that are being left behind. So the fact that in the United States we're having an immigration debate, and the other side of that is not an education debate, because it ought to be two sides of the same coin, puzzles me. STEM skills, there needs to be a serious reevaluation of STEM training for students all around the world.
Can I say a word about
Yeah,
skills of the future?
Yeah.
For many of us in countries like Colombia, skills of the future is not so much about choosing what to study or suggesting or making recommendations. It's about the ability of people to go to college, to enroll in tertiary education, technical, technological, university education. 7 years ago, Colombia only enrolled 36 out.
You could join up their kind of answers, because on the one hand, we agree, you know, people talk about the digital economy. It's not, it's the fact that digitalization, like the tram tracks of the future, they're already here, they're fastly accelerating, but that means while every area of our economy, at least for those that are connected, remember 50% of the world's people are not yet connected to the internet, so that's a whole other level of challenge. But when you look at the fact that if you take the engineers, I interviewed two Indian software engineers just a couple of months ago, and you remember the first wave of outsourcing in this traditional model of globalization everyone thinks has benefited everyone. Well, in India, of course, you have 93% of the jobs are informal. They're informal. And these software engineers were supposed to be the big winners. But in fact, what's happened is their jobs have become informal freelancers, because no longer are they being employed by companies who are simply using the next technology application, training people on that, and when it's done, they're done. So it is about saying, how do we employ graduates, how do you create jobs, but how do we also take responsibility for formalising work, and what's the regulatory framework, so that we're not just going to see the worst of globalisation sins today transformed and multiplied as digitalisation changes the way we do business, not necessarily what we do business about, because the industries of today will be there tomorrow. The tasks might be different, but indeed, while skilling is a luxury I think we can solve, unless we invest in jobs, you're going to have more of the same.
So we're going to go to questions in the audience in just a minute. I want to take two of the questions first that we have that we've received online. The first one is from someone named Samir. What can we do to attract more R&D activities from multinationals in developing economies and to embed them into their national innovation systems better? So this is multinational R&D investments in developing economies. It's probably the sort of question you think about, Minister Cardenas. Do you have a view on how that works?
Sure. Well, you have to create incentives. I think multinationals are not going to do that without having an economic logic and rationale for it. One option naturally is tax incentives. Ensure that you provide a context in which companies invest in R&D, and those investments are deductible. That's one aspect. Another aspect is to ensure that there is a dialogue with the corporations, that when they want to operate, they want to have access to a market, which is a large market. Of course, India is the best example. Colombia is a 50 million population country. Access to that market, but also make sure that you invest. You just not sell products to that market. You invest also in expanding the technological frontier. So it's dialogue, it's incentives, and it's also on the part of the corporations' commitment that they want to do it, that they feel it's important, that they feel it's necessary.
Another question, this one is from Anonymous. Hello, everyone. My question is, how does gender relate to globalization? Chanda, maybe I'll ask you as a female CEO, do you have any view on gender in the sort of dynamic with globalization?
Yeah, so just first on the R&D, I'd just add that I think also what you need to create is the talent, because the MNCs would take their R&D to where they'd find the right talent, apart from the other things that were spoken. But I think that is what we've seen in India, that the companies are creating their centers of various kinds. Some are very simple back office centers, some are very high-tech R&D centers, because they find the right talent there. And then the R&D is done partly for the Indian market, but partly for the rest of the world. On the concept of gender, first of all, when we talk of diversity in workforce, I think we only tend to think of gender diversity. I think as we look at globalization, we should talk of all forms of diversity. It's diversity across different aspiration levels, it's diversity across different age groups, it's diversity across different backgrounds, and so on. But what I have seen, at least if I talk about India, is that I think India has again done much better than the many parts of the world when it comes to gender diversity. I think basically the recognition has to be more economic rather than a nice to have attitude. When you recognize that you cannot grow and prosper if you ignore half of your talent force. How can a company grow? How can a country grow if you keep aside half of your talent force? I think that's the recognition that actually encourages policies which then include more and more women in the workforce. And India has gone through that. There was a time when women hardly used to even apply to certain jobs because they used to feel that they're not welcome in that. From there today, there are companies who are actually encouraging women to be part of the workforce. But not just that, I think there is no country in the world that I see where the fighter pilots, there are a lot of women, where the most athletes in the most difficult so-called men-related fields, the Olympic medals are won by girls and women, where even the warships now, a huge amount of R&D is being done by women, where in NASA there are teams which are only women. And then finally, as a banker, I would say I've not seen a country in the world where 40% of the banking is headed by women.
Okay, that's a dare or a goal you're putting out there. We're going to go to questions in the audience, and do you just have a quick
thing? Two very quick comments.
Yeah.
One is, building on the Minister and Chanda's comments, yes, you've got to have a welcoming market and you've got to have talent, but then any large company would be foolish to think they can concentrate its innovation and R&D in one country. In fact, we're arguing just the opposite, that if you want to really take advantage of the huge base of global consumers, you need to diversify where you do innovation and leverage connectivity. And the second, just because Chanda said it so well, we just published a report yesterday about how diversity drives innovation. It was a multi-country study, and she's exactly right that yes, gender is really important, but there's actually multiple forms of diversity that drive innovation. There were 6 that were all statistically significant, and the 3 most important ones were background, industry backgrounds, people of different industries, nationality background, and gender. And then when you put those 3 together, you get a meaningful impact in innovation.
Okay, we're going to go to the room now. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you, and I'll ask you when you, if you stand up and say your name and your organization. Can you hand the microphone out to somebody? Okay, right here. Thank you. Then we'll.
Good evening. I'm a global shaper. My name is Leysan Arsentьeva from Kazan, Republic of Tatarstan, Russia. My question is about educational system and what should modern companies do? Should they wait until government reforms educational system, or should they provide in-house training for skills which they need? Thank you so much.
So, does anybody want to?
I mean, that's a no-brainer. I remember a time in the Australian economy where we had to reskill the economy, had to reshape the economy. We'd opened the markets, floated the dollar, all the usual kind of piece. And there was, in fact, an absolute commitment by businesses to actually invest in structured training. Somewhere around the late 90s, that just crashed. And now I hear CEOs talking about, oh, we need lifelong learning to deal with the future. And I think, where have you been for the last 25 years? Because this has been a concept. And if companies don't invest in their own training, then they're not going to keep their actual employees, but they're not going to skill themselves up. And that goes to the question of gender. If women aren't in the workforce in the same numbers, for starters, if by any indication on any indicator progress for women has actually stagnated in this global economy, and we're not conscious of investing in both their education and other areas of care so they can participate, then we're not serious about growth, productivity, inclusion, whatever kind of indicator you want to put on it. So companies can't simply stand back and blame someone else. Of course, we should all work together. I'm a teacher by trade. We must have quality education everywhere. But if companies simply say, well, it's somebody else's fault, I'm sorry, but they're not equipped to be part of a future, a sustainable future.
Okay, we have some questions over here. We'll take these two. Thank you.
Anil Gupta, University of Maryland. A question probably to Ms. Kochhar. So there are two big trends and wanted to see how those intersect. So one, of course, is rising inequality, and India is certainly a part of that story. But the second, of course, is the massive spread in broadband, mobile broadband. Would the hypothesis be valid that the digital connectivity that you talked about is actually potentially arrest or slow down or reverse growing inequality?
Yeah, I think clearly connectivity actually, in fact, brings more and more people participate in the economic growth. And I really believe that the world, and especially India, I think it's a DSM world, digital, social and mobile. And every business has to kind of reorient their own business model so that they become seamlessly a part of the DSM life of the individuals. And the way connectivity has spread in India, I think it's not just democratization of technology, but it's democratization of opportunities. The market linkages that I spoke about, we are able to provide market linkages to many of those people who we train only through use of technology. There are now today women in the villages who are through WhatsApp sending their embroidery designs to those factories, which are in the same district but still many kilometers away. There is therefore money that comes directly into the bank accounts through use of technology. We have seen that in some of the villages where we have worked, earlier somebody would go and sell milk and just be reliant on the cooperative or the head of the cooperative to say what was the weight of the milk, how much money they should get, and then wait for 20 days to get the money and so on. Just put technology, we put milk measurement systems there. Now the villagers come and pour the milk. The machine checks the fat content, checks the weight, and calculates what is the amount to be paid to the villager, and that money is directly paid from the cooperative bank account from the cooperative's account to the villager's account. So this is what technology does. I think technology is democratizing prosperity and bringing more and more people into economic inclusion.
I'm going to take a question from here and then we'll come back to the room because it's related. This question is, besides microloans, what specific steps have you seen governments in emerging countries do that really allowed them to take advantage of globalization? Are there any other specific measures that any of you can think of?
Well, there are a number of programs that, of course, are targeted towards improving the opportunities in the context of globalization. I would just begin by saying that in countries with limited resources, and especially fiscal resources, targeting programs is much better, because then you can achieve more and you can reduce the specific issues for specific groups of the population. Some of the policies that are more horizontal have to do with financial inclusion. It's not just micro-lending. It's also access to technologies to make payments, digital payments, building a history of payments, which enables that individual to get a loan when you're in the informal sector. Some of the reforms also have to do with the ability to provide a subsidy so people can progress in the education ladder. That's also very important. But in addition, For example, in the agricultural sector, you need to make sure that people have access to technologies. You need to make sure they have access to knowledge. And sometimes they have access to land, ownership of land. So all those programs together are really what enables people to take advantage of globalization.
We're going to take one more question here, actually, right. Sorry, the gentleman right there. Thank you.
Lesecha Khanya, South African Reserve Bank. Two quick things. I got worried the way the discussion is going. We're talking about the benefits of economic globalization, and we had reduced it almost purely to individuals. But to be controversial, how are you going to deal with the challenges of economic globalization without a global government? How does the global governance system respond to the issue of globalization? Check how the major economies have responded to globalization. Many countries have embraced it. Check the response to blocking investments to emerging market economies that says that you are a company of this country, you shall not invest, you shall not export the jobs there. And therein lies the problem. We can't protect jobs because the nature of jobs are changing, but we can protect people. And so the focus should be, how do we protect people? But the political narrative is to try and protect jobs. That's the first one. The second one, and I will close there because Ms. Kwacha had sort of like touched on this, and it was raised by Ms. Barrow. The talk of, oh, these jobs have been informalized, oh, these software engineers, they are sitting there, they are not employed by any company. Has anybody bothered to ask them what they actually would like to do? And here we are as elites trying to tell the poor what jobs to accept, how to shape their lives, instead of asking the poor, in this changing environment, what sort of protection would you be looking for in order for you to take advantage of prosperity?
Great, thank you.
Here. You know, if you talk to working people, they know their industries, they know their communities, they've got big ideas, they've got aspirations for themselves and their children. I couldn't agree more. And I was sitting here thinking about that last question about what more should governments do. We were part of a conversation about global commons not too long ago, and if the world is so focused on, you know, hopefully it's going to be a reformed globalization because we couldn't accept more of the same, but nevertheless, let's assume that we'll fix the climate environment, we'll fix, you know, the regulatory environment for technology, that people will be included. You can't do that if we're not thinking about how collectively we are providing opportunities. And one of the things that has always struck me is that if 1 in 6 oxygen molecules comes from the Amazon, for example, yet we are not prepared to pay collectively, you know, an income to the indigenous people of the Amazon who actually, you know, care for the forests themselves. And, you know, I hear scientists go on, and I agree with them about the raping of biodiversity. But again, those same indigenous people do have more knowledge and can do more to care for retaining biodiversity. But we simply think in terms of big business, you know, dominant market share. I'd ask you, how is Amazon going to fix that for us? You know, what's monopoly power that's not even earning money in the marketplace right now actually going to do to actually listen to the people, to have communities reinvent themselves with support in an interconnected world that cares about each other?
So we're just about out of time. I'm going to ask each of the panelists just in basically a sentence to summarize what they think the key thing is for globalization to save it from itself. Sharon, I'm going to start with you. You were the most critical in the beginning about this. Do you believe that globalization can be saved from itself? Yeah.
If we change the rules.
So you've been convinced in the last 60
years. I said the current model of globalization has failed working people. I didn't say globalization was a bad thing. Yeah. You know, I'm an international union leader. I want to see quality jobs everywhere. I want to see people have the opportunities and the social protection I know we can afford. But we must have a new social contract. We must change the rules.
Great. Rich, what's the key thing?
I think the most important thing is what we think of as globalization, the paradigm that's in our head is changing out from under us very quickly.
Because of
it's not that there
technology.
won't be globalization. We'll connect in different ways. We'll connect around services, we'll connect around digital, and the classic focus on production as the definition of globalization is going to shift. And therefore the biggest challenge is how do we all, and I mean that both government and business, prepare the current generation and the next generation of workers to do this, and how do governments and businesses adopt a multi-stakeholder mindset around
Great.
it?
We're just about out of time. Just really quickly, Manoush.
Education will make globalization better because more people will benefit from it.
Great. Devin.
Education and access.
Great. Minister Cardenas.
I think we've been focusing on the national responses and what we have to do at the local level, but we also have to think about coordination, cooperation. This is not something that's going to work for one country, thinking that all the benefits are going to come to that country. We have to create an environment for more cooperation.
Chanda.
Yeah, I think people are connected in any case, so the world is connected. So the issue is how does the entire world work in coordination? And also in every country, it's not just about the government, how do government and private sector work together? And in my view, there are 3 E's therefore: education, employment, and entrepreneurship. If we enable that,
So we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you folks who are watching online.
Yan, ha? Namin yun. Appreciate nyo ba, guys? Yan. So, dami nilang, tinakal, ano? So, ang labas lang talaga is, napaka-importante. Creative Commons yan, attribution, license, reuse, allowed. So, World Economic Forum. Yan ang ating natutunan sa mga araw na ito ngayon. Guys, yung globalization, economic globalization. Nasabi na, kailangan yung isang tao ay magkaroon ng training, skills, at kailangan ang tao ay pautangin. Yun lang naman ang gusto sabihin dun, di ba? Pautangin. At kailangan yakapin yung technology sa mga local area, sa mga rural area, even the farmers. Kasi sabi nga doon is not just to give technology or to familiar in technology, but to give opportunity. So you are able to claim or apply after your application in loan or lending. You get the money, but the question is how you are going to pay for that in terms of technology, because there is an opportunity. See? And then you're not anymore going into the outlet or to the branch, but because of the technology, it's easy to access in payment. So that is why the poor people must have a training for the skills attached to the technology, embrace the technology and the diversity. Yung sinabi, diversity, demographic youth, diversity. Yan, profession skill. Sabi pa nga doon is technology is not sector. Technology is economics, sabi. So, kailangan daw inclusion of economics. Not just only inclusion of subsidy, but inclusion of economics. Tinalakay pa doon, di ba? So, economic globalization, wherein there is a multinational corporation investing to us other countries, but the problem there is the local or the domestic corporation, even especially the small medium enterprise, how they compete to the multinational corporation. Although the multinational corporation gives employment to the domestic to the country wherein the multinational corporation invest. Nagbibigay nga ng employment, but the problem is how about the entrepreneur? How about the businessman, the local businessman? It's hard for them to compete the multinational corporation. So that is why the government protectionism uh, observed, which means that tarifa is higher the final tax rate to the multinational corporation. That is why we have the final tax, some sort of like that. So we learn a lot. So what we learn, the economic globalization, that is more on about multinational corporation, and then as what we learn on the discussions about the forum, no, that we must study education is the best at all. We must be an entrepreneur, and also employ, and also what is this, be part of the economics. Are you, that is why the Wi-Fi, the internet is very important for us to be part of the economy, economic globalization. That is a contribution to the country, to the you are part of the transaction globally. You order your products to the Lazada. Globalization is really observes or happens because of the internet. So embrace yourself to the technology, have an skills, have an educations, be an entrepreneur. Yun lang, dun lang naman umiikot yan eh. And then the government subsidy, not only subsidy, give or give an assistance to the poor people, and equality, not inequality in globalization opportunity. Yan. Yan ang inobserve dun eh. And then give credit or loan to the people in order the people become an entrepreneur. And how they become an entrepreneur? Give training to them. Give skills, no? Yan ang pinag-aralan doon. Yan ang sinasabi. So, at least we have an idea about the globalization. So, hanggang sa muli, sa unang yugto ng ating discussion about sa globalization, we will discuss pa rin ng iba dito. So, economic globalization pa lang yan. We have a political globalization. And next one, cultural globalization. So, those are types of globalization. Effects of globalization, examples of globalization. We will discuss that. Advantages of globalization, disadvantages of globalization. Yan. So, we will discuss that. So, inabot tayong 1 hour and 42 minutes. So, hanggang sa muli, babos, ingat,